Jesus Christ is the King of the universe. May all other rulers cast their crowns before his feet. Please be seated. In an age of democratically elected leaders, for some reason, we can't quite seem to be able to completely shake the image of a noble king. Maybe it's the pageantry, the drama of royal family life. Maybe it's because Bishop Curry sometimes likes to preach at royal weddings. Maybe it's the chivalrous stories of knights and noble kings that capture our imaginations. Dean Frederick Farrar of Canterbury Cathedral wrote in 1895, writing about Queen Victoria, that after hearing a sermon, she once approached the dean and said to him, "Oh, how I wish that the Lord might come during my own lifetime." "Why?" asked the dean. "Does your majesty feel this earnest desire?" "Oh," replied the queen, with quivering lips and with her whole countenance lighted by deep emotion, "I should so love to lay my crown at his feet." Another example of kingship can be seen in one of my favorite Disney movies, 1973's Robin Hood. In it, King John, here depicted as a scraggly lion, serves as a poor substitute to his more kingly brother, Richard, who is off on crusade. John serves as a poor and unjust substitute for his brother, and although King Richard is absent for the majority of the film, the driving problem is this: the good king is away, and the phony king, John, is not a good substitute. Richard's crown doesn't fit upon his head, and John doesn't understand the responsibility of kingship towards Richard's people. He thinks that if he can dress the part and look like a king and wield the power, he can be king. But he's missing something. He's a phony king. Everyone can see it. There seems to be a weird contradiction that when God is present, we can't help but cast our crowns before him, and in this way we can truly participate in God's kingdom. When God seems far away to us, we finally have room to play king of our own lives. But at the end of the day, we are, like John, phony kings and queens of our own lives. Our psalm for today, Psalm 132, brilliantly weaves together themes of kingship and of real presence, not as a matter of straightforward earthly kingship, but how God reigns as both King of all creation and one who is real and present among us. Psalm 132 is a hymn exalting in the greatness of God's presence and the practical implications of that presence on the land, for the community, for the kingdom, remembering specifically how God worked mightily in the life of King David. It remembers how God has worked through history and yearns to see God's work in the world today. For the psalmist, the importance of God's real presence in history cannot be overstated. It can be assumed for the psalmist that he is aware of God's omnipotence, of his transcendence, the fact that God is all in all places and in all things. But at the same time, the psalmist is anxious about God, even in his transcendence, showing forth his immanent presence in a physical space. It's important and true that God is everywhere, but Israel needs to know where the Ark of the Covenant is. It acknowledges the bigness of God, and it yearns for the closeness of God. We heard the ark was in Ephratah, that is, Bethlehem. We found it in the fields of Jerim. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Rise up, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priest be clothed with salvation, and let your faithful shout with joy. For your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. There's a desperation in searching for God's presence here. They are anxious to draw near to the Ark of the Covenant. David won't even sleep until the Ark is brought into his city. Israel felt the primal need for God's presence to be with them, because with this instantiation of God's presence in a physical place came the promise for David's line. David, described in the psalm, viscerally desires God's presence in his city like a child desiring the presence of their mother. Good kingship just couldn't be envisioned without God's presence. David knows his temporal kingship is only derivative of God's presence, and David is only an effective monarch in that he's ready to cast that crown before God. But Psalm 132 isn't just a propaganda piece about how King David is a good king because he's religious. It's a promise rooted in God's presence in history, demonstrated through the life of David. And the promise is this: the Lord swore to David a sure oath from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the decrees that I shall teach them, their sons also forevermore shall sit on your throne. There's a Christological promise here that one of David's descendants will sit on his throne forever, that this son, as real and active in history as the ark of God's presence, would satisfy its poor with bread, would clothe its priests with salvation, and its faithful he would cause to shout for joy. The kingship that David merely held as a steward will be overshadowed by a greater reign, a reign that David eagerly longed to cast his own crown before. Now, King David didn't reign over Israel as king forever. He died, and his descendants ruled in his place. They, however, lost the plot. They ruled for themselves, forgetting that their kingship and its promise was rooted in God's presence among his people. In fact, they seemed to prefer a God that would maybe leave them alone so they could get on with rule themselves. So they made idols to worship instead, more manageable gods that they thought that they could control. And eventually, the Ark of the Covenant was lost. And eventually, the monarchs of Israel and Judah fell. Their kingdoms failed. God seemed far off, and kings were proven to be bad substitutes. Many years later, in our gospel reading, we see the example of a different ruler. In our gospel reading, Pilate doesn't know what to do with, is inconvenienced by, and doesn't really have any use for Jesus. Much like the idolatrous kings who followed after David, Pilate saw religion as simply a part of his cultural identity, perhaps giving him a mandate alongside his authority from Rome to exercise government. The inconvenient burden of God's covenant with David has no bearing on Pilate. God is more useful when he is far off and not bothering anyone. And so when Jesus is brought before Pilate, he's first concerned by this man who's calling himself king. And then he's confused by Christ's claim that his kingship is a higher kingship, that it's not of this world. Pilate doesn't understand what David knew, that his kingship is utterly dependent on God's reign. Pilate is only concerned with avoiding threats and problems within his own rule. When he can't find any use for Jesus, he discards him and washes his hands. David danced for joy when the ark of God's presence was brought into Jerusalem. Pilate waffled and washed his hands when Jesus, the very Son of God, was brought before him into Jerusalem. David was desperate to lay down his rule before God, to whom he owed his very life. Pilate wanted to keep God far away because the implications of God's presence are just too overwhelming. Because unlike Pilate's pagan gods, the Christ before him could not be controlled or placated. So what can we take away from these two very different rulers? God does not rule simply by sitting on a throne in some far-off place that we can't see, leaving us to our own devices. God is really, truly present, and he has worked through history and remains present with us here and now. Trying to keep God far off and abstract simply will not work. The idolatrous kings after David made images, idols of gods, which they could, in this way, control or appease through sacrifice. It was an easy answer that keeps God far away and let them off the hook. Heresies throughout church history, like Marcionism, which denied that God worked through the history of Israel, or Gnosticism, that rejected the idea that God would have anything to do with earthly flesh and temporal history. And more recently, deism, which wanted to make God a far-off being who created earth and then backed off to leave us alone. People attempt in this way to dethrone God by making him more abstract, by trying to keep his presence far away. Like Pilate, we think we're getting a good deal by keeping God's presence at a comfortable distance, freeing us up to live our own lives. But in this hand-washing and avoidance of God, we're cheating ourselves of the real, loving presence of Christ. David knew this. David, who searched desperately for the ark, who would not sleep until he found it, who longed to bring God's presence into Jerusalem, who knew his reign was utterly predicated on God's reign penetrating into history, that God's presence, as in the ark, would someday walk into Jerusalem in the person of Jesus and appear before Pontius Pilate, that this Jesus would take the throne of David as he was lifted up on the cross and crowned with a crown of thorns, that this Jesus would not rest in the temple, but in a tomb which ultimately could not contain him, that this Jesus would, as the psalm says, satisfy the poor with bread, the bread of his body when he instituted the Eucharist. And his reigning at the right hand of the Father would not only be glorious and heavenly, but unmistakably earthy and real. The reality is that God doesn't reign as an old man up in the sky, far away and uncaring. God reigns as the Lamb who was slain for the life of the world, continually drawing us to himself. God isn't just up there waiting for us to join him in the afterlife. He comes to us on the altars of our churches in the Eucharist, his very body and blood nourishing us and flowing through our veins in a way even more intimate than his presence in the Ark of the Covenant. God reigns in the hospital room, joining with the suffering of real people every day, because Christ also suffered, and he promises to be present in our hardships. God reigns in death, because Christ in his own death and resurrection has conquered the grave and gives us a sure, certain, concrete hope for the resurrection of the dead. God reigns in our hearts, the more we are willing to cast our crowns at the foot of the cross, when we can accept that we don't have it all figured out, that we're poor substitutes and phony kings. When we hand over the kingdom of our hearts to Jesus, he reigns there, truly present in our lives, as we're then empowered to go out and participate in the glorious kingdom that God is building, where the hungry are fed, where we are clothed with righteousness and salvation, and where the warm lamp of God's presence in the world is never extinguished. Blessed be Christ the King on his glorious throne in heaven, on the altars of his holy Catholic Church, and in the hearts of his faithful people everywhere. Amen.